Hello and welcome to Ignore All Previous Instructions. I'm Pam and I'm here with Christine Lemmer-Webber this episode. Welcome, Christine. So happy to have you here. Could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I'm Christine Lemmer-Webber. I'm the executive director of the Spritely Institute, also a co-founder of it and both the technical project and the nonprofit. We are, I guess if you may also know me for, I worked on the Activity Pub protocol, which it connects together what's known as the Fediverse, right, the decentralized federated social web. So Mastodon uses that specification, and so do a number of other projects, like GoToSocial, like PeerTube, like PixelFed, etc. They all communicate with each other over this protocol called ActivityPub. So that's kind of my claim to fame, I guess, historically. And then kind of the newer things that are happening are at the Spritely Institute, where we are developing kind of next generation decentralized network technology. It's been historically kind of very like programmery oriented because we're kind of
Mm-hmm.
building it up in steps. And occasionally has the illusion that we are like people are like, are you a video game organization? It's like, no, 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 no. We're just building the games to make it exciting and explain some of the tech. So I sent you some demos last night actually that
Mm-hmm.
were video game oriented. So happy to explain, kind of how that ends up happening and like the things that they show off and etc. But I know I'm jumping ahead of myself already. We have quite a bit of interesting technology we could talk about that's sprightly related,
So
you
much.
know,
Mm-hmm.
uh, a lot of cultural interest overlap stuff that I'm sure we could talk about as well. But it's great talking to you.
Let's talk. Yeah. So something I was interested in, well, it's like this is maybe let's start with saying this idea and then we can roll three steps back from it. But what I want to talk about eventually is that the that programmery kind of centric thing that is kind of happening with these, ideas on, oh, let's design a new decentralized, a new social thing, and they brainy is the word that I come up with. And I know you shared a talk that you and Randy did, where it was re-decentralizing social networks. And I speed ran through that video, like I had it on 2x because I was cramming. But were they decentralized in the past, or what do you mean by the re was confusing? Because the only re I found was, oh, I've been working on these things, but then they weren't, let's call it mainstream.
Well, so we can look at it in this way. So the goals for the internet were much more decentralized, right? I think if you look at kind of the 1990s version of the internet, right, and the early 2000s version of the internet, things were a lot more decentralized then, right? There were the web had a whole lot, like people kind of spread themselves across a lot more websites, that
There are a
they
lot
would end
more
up visiting.
villages.
Yeah, yeah, a lot more villages. If you
We
look
had a
at
lot
like
of
the
villages, and now we have like two cities.
right, yeah, if you looked at like the
Yeah,
blogosphere, for example, if you ever heard that
sure.
term,
Love it.
which was
Yes.
like, people have like a lot of individually hosted blogs. For a while there, RSS readers were really popular.
Mm-hmm. R.I.P.
And
Google Reader. Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah, and Google Reader was actually a very popular way of people kind of like reading stuff from a bunch of different places, and it was a little bit ironic actually. Google Reader is actually a great example of how sometimes these things fall apart, right? Because like
Mm.
the system as a whole was decentralized in that lots of people were hosting different sites, and like this was kind of the era of like I'd say like kind of the height of web comics and like a bunch of like some
Mm-hmm.
interesting indie produced media and stuff like that, being hosted on individual, servers, individual places, and a lot of different like, like individual, like writing and stuff like that. It wasn't all on Medium, etc. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and um, and then like Facebook and Twitter kind of came in, and they kind of became the places where people were publishing content. And because
Mm-hmm.
of that, um, the like the way that like media ended up being produced, distributed, etc., ended up moving to a few kind of centralized places. Um, we've seen centralization in a lot of ways. Also like more and it's less common for people to be hosting on things that are not Amazon, right? Amazon has taken over a lot of the
Right.
hosting
The
space.
cloud. Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and we've seen some advancement in which, like a decade and a half ago, it was very uncommon to convince people that like open source type things were like important, worthwhile, etc. And now in some ways that's become the default, right? But it's the default for building a set of technologies that are to empower corporations, right? As opposed to empower individuals, right? So if you look at kind of like the origins of free and open source software, it was very much so about user empowerment. Um, and where it ended up going was to much more about kind of corporate empowerment, right? So
Hmm.
in many ways, about when we talk about re-decentralizing, so in that video, you're right also that like Randy and so on show off like they were working on technologies in like the 1990s and so on that is just assumed the internet was going to be decentralized, right? We're building out this whole internet thing.
Hmm.
Why would we go back in, a centralized place? Of course, it's going to just keep moving further and further out and become more and more empowering. And that's not what happened, right? When I asked Randy, and several other people who worked on, there's this amazing organization called Electric Communities that built this incredible thing called Electric Communities Habitat, and also this programming language called E, which Spritely is largely inspired by and builds off of.
Mm.
And they managed to build peer-to-peer 3D virtual worlds with user-run content where you could safely run untrusted code with like user-run economies and stuff like that. And it was fully peer-to-peer, and this was in like 1997.
So that's really, I want to jump in and say that's really interesting. And that until you told me like about that via sharing that talk, I hadn't learned about that. If I think of, oldie timey virtual worlds, I think of Second Life.
Second Life came after, actually, yeah.
Mm.
And um, in some ways, like electric communities kind of came too soon, right? So the
Mm.
story of all this stuff when it comes to me and my work is that I I after ActivityPub succeeded, and like Mastodon picked it up, it was a made it through the W3C standardization process, which was not easy. That was a very kind of difficult 4-year process to be able to get it there.
Four
Um,
years. Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
That's probably
we
short in terms of these kinds of things. Mm.
uh ish,
Mid.
but but
Okay.
but ActivityPub was unusual, especially in that it was a very community run standard, which was very uncommon for like W3C and IETF standards and stuff, which are usually really run by corporations, right? So,
Hmm.
um, the um, so part of the thing was that I was like, well, what can't we do, right? If servers go down, people lose their content, right? That's a
Hmm.
concern. Things are not quite as private as I would like them to be. It's not as secure. It's not as peer to peer. There's all these things I feel like we can't do, and like where did they solve this? And as a test, I've always kind of viewed it as a test. I was like, if you were able to run like a completely decentralized like virtual world, like imagine Second Life or like like a giant Minecraft thing with like people connecting across all these servers or whatever, or something like
Right.
that, but it's completely decentralized. But you had like that would be an interesting use case because you have to solve all the problems of like identity and so on and so forth, and like the permissions and security and all that stuff like that. So for me, a lot of games often end up being a use case. So the funny thing is that when starting Sprightly, I kind of like the initial, um, uh, like kind of marketing of Sprightly was actually we're going to build decentralized virtual worlds, and it
Mm.
was difficult to convince anyone that that was even something worth doing. And then the metaverse hype happened,
That's what I
and
was
then
just thinking as I was thinking, well, at the same time that Meta was, gonna make this big bet. So that
but that
happened
was after.
after.
That happened after
Yeah.
Sprightly was announced, and they completely aimed for the wrong things, right? They aimed for
Mm.
goggles and gloves, right? They aimed
Right.
for, like this kind of visual aesthetic thing,
Physical immersion.
the physical immersion, not the important or difficult part.
Mm.
if you can have a completely text-based virtual world and have it be decentralized, and if you can manage to do that, or a simple 2D virtual world, you'll still solve all the hard problems at that level before you bring in the goggles and gloves, right? So
Hmm.
like their version of like this thing is like, somebody spending too much time like reading Snow Crash, or or even worse, watching or reading Ready Player One or something like that, and like it being like, yeah, like I want to
Yeah, that
build
sounds
that, right?
great.
Yeah, like but like
Ugh.
it's kind of misses like actually what the interesting challenges are, right? So there's kind of a recurring theme within Spritely where we end up using games as a way to be able to show things off and to test ourselves, because it's a way of being able to. I'm probably jumping a bit ahead because we haven't
That's
even talked
fine.
about like the demo I sent you and stuff like that. But
Right.
this is all to say that like I actually think an important thing within Spritely is keeping things fun, because a lot of this stuff can feel really grueling and abstract and so on and so forth. And so we put a lot of effort into kind of the visual appearance of, like kind of like the aesthetics around the project, kind of the cute characters and so on and so forth. And it's partly because like it can be a lot of this can seem very abstract and computer sciencey and stuff like that.
That's,
And
yeah, the brainy thing. That's, I
yeah,
think about, talking about, like, I'm interested in these things. I think we can, kind of we're in agreement that the things that we're doing right now aren't working.
mhm.
And then we want to change them. And you're actively working on stuff to change them. But I wonder about how this eventually reaches an average person,
Mhm.
or how
Okay.
does it make their internet life better or easier, or how do they even get there?
It's sometimes difficult from a early position to be able to, when you're trying to work towards a goal, to be able to explain what it's going to look like when you get there. This is a very common problem. I experience this with ActivityPub. Right now, it's very
Right.
easy for people to conceive of Mastodon, etc. It was impossible for me to explain to most people what I was working
Because
on
they
for
didn't
most.
exist.
Yeah, it didn't exist,
Mm,
right? And people were like, I'd
mm.
said like, well, imagine if Facebook or Twitter was decentralized, and people were like, can you do that?
Is that
Like,
possible?
yeah, is
Like,
that
yeah.
possible? Right? And so now we're talking about something even more advanced than decentralized Twitter and
Mm,
Facebook. We're talking about all of computing being decentralized in network but secure, right? So
mm-hmm.
the real way to think about Spritely is changing the default so that all computing, when you write a program by default, is distributed and decentralized and secure. And by
Mm-hmm.
default, it's peer to peer. And like that's the default output you get when you end up building on top of our tools.
Mm.
And so, so that all software can be social and collaborative, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we see that like when, a lot of work has been poured into, for example, LibreOffice, but it's difficult to compete with something like Google Docs, right?
Sure.
Like having stuff be collaborative and be social, it's is really important. But it currently takes super experts to be able to build that stuff. What we're trying to do is build actually foundations so that we've already solved a lot of the super expert problems. And actually, that's why we're a research institution. Um,
Mm.
so right now, Spritely is moving through multiple phases. So there's multiple phases of the tech stack, and there's also multiple phases of how we reach people. So of the tech stack, the simplest phases are, or not simplest, actually very complicated. The most fundamental stages are in this very, you're saying kind of brainy technology where we're taught like, before the Spritely Institute launched, I basically spent about 4 or 5 years doing hard research problems, like on the computer
Mm.
science end of things, trying to like figure out how all these pieces fit together. And by the time we launched the institute, we already had a roadmap of how all the pieces were going to work. Like this piece is going to do this piece is going to do this piece is going to do this.
Right. Yeah, your like codex is fantastic.
Yeah, like it's like a monster manual because like there's actually a different
Yeah,
creature that
it's
corresponds to
fun.
each thing.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's why it's sprightly is there's all these different sprites. They're like forest creatures working together to build this bigger vision. And so the right now the vision that Spritely's presenting sounds very far away and abstract, and it sounds big, right? It sounds like, like how are we going to reach that with users, right? We're in a similar situation to with ActivityPub, where we are laying down foundations that are hard for people to kind of view from this position what it will be like. And then we can talk about what it would be like, right? But for right now, we're focusing on a lot of foundations, and then when you have those foundations, you can then build the next thing. You build the actual applications. We said we're building the foundations so that it's easy to build those applications, right? And then you actually have the applications, and so the early applications will be very, like kind of enthusiast oriented, right? Like if you
Yeah.
think about like a lot of free and open source software tooling, right? You might have somebody working on a library, right? They're
Hmm.
working on or even figuring out how to solve some hard problem, right? Um, and um, and the first version might be actually like a library that's like an abstract library for programmers to integrate with their programs. And then somebody might take that and they might make a command line program, right? And the command line
Hmm.
program makes it so you don't have to code the library itself. Somebody who's, a little bit more technically proficient can do things at the command line and use things, but they don't have to be a programmer, but they're still very technically skilled, right? And then
Hmm.
eventually somebody builds a user-facing application that doesn't require even being a command line user, right? It's got a nice
Right.
graphical user
That's
interface and front
yeah.
end. Either it's a desktop application or a web application or both. And that's kind of, you can think about moving through those different phases of abstraction as kind of the course that Spritely is on. And right now, that core layer of that developer layer of things is really starting to firm up. We're really getting to the point where that's really solid. So we have a distributed object programming environment, and this again sounds very brainy. In fact, there's a
Hmm.
Spritely project called Brainy. I don't know if you even knew that, but it's not
There's
relevant to
so many
this.
monsters. Yes.
It is relevant to it's not actually one we advertise because it's actually a little bit an alternative view of what it's a huge tangent. It's an alternative view of what artificial intelligence could be like if it was more user friendly and or more user freedom oriented, like actually respectful
Hmm.
of users. It's a different branch of computer science but it's not important. It's a decentralized kind of problem solving system. But it's used for interesting for certain types of things, but that's kind of a research project we don't advertise much. But it's the funny thing is that it's actually called Brainy. But
Yes.
the real thing is we actually have two really core. We have three sort of core things. One of them is a protocol. So we have a core programming environment called Goblins. So
Yes.
Goblins is our distributed object programming environment. When you write Goblins programs, they're by default distributed, secure. They can run. They can
What
communicate with other Goblins programs across the
when
network.
what does it mean to be secure by default? Because I think
Okay.
that would like what does that actually mean?
Okay. So if I sent you a let's say I sent you, and it can be for whatever operating system, but imagine I sent you solitaire.exe and an email,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
and I say, hey, open this up, double click it, open this program.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good idea?
No, it's a terrible idea.
Why?
Yes.
What if it was?
Because who knows what's in there?
And why is that? It's because the program runs as you, right? And so it can do all the
Mm-hmm.
things you can do, right? It can access your files, it can upload them to the network, it can crypto
It can
locker your
install
hard drive.
another program to spy on you, to log
What
your
if
keys.
what if it
Yeah.
couldn't? What if it couldn't?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what if instead it ran within something that's kind of like a sandbox and it only had the things we gave it permission. So like for example, we might give it permission to be able to access this window that only can that we can draw to. So it can draw the game of
Mm-hmm.
solitaire.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also it can read keyboard and mouse input, but only while you're in the window, right? It can't key log you or anything like that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the way that Goblin's programs work The way that object capability security works is actually like ordinary computer programming. You can imagine a function that just, all it can do is like, it doesn't have any ability to do anything special with like it can just compute things, right, by default. You have to pass in special ability to the function to do interesting things like access the screen and so on. So you might pass in as an argument the ability to access the screen, right? And
Hmm.
like give it this window object that's specially privileged. And then you can also pass in access to one file, which is the high scores file. And it could write nasty things to that maybe, but nothing else. It can't read or write anything else. Right? And so
Hmm.
actually there are flows that you use on your computer that do these types of things, and they can even actually have intuitive user flows. So an example is um, it what happens when you go to a web page and you want to upload a file? Um, Amazingly, you go and click browse, and you give it a specific file that you want from your computer, and it's able to
Hmm.
access only that file,
Hmm.
no other files on your computer, and upload it. And most users don't even realize they've given it they've passed it a capability, right? So we're using capability security. They've passed it the ability to access this specific file, but
Interesting.
not all other files. And so this is called a power box. It's not important to go into that
A
detail, but
power
this is,
box?
yeah, it's a capability
It's a
security
fun name.
concept. Yeah, the idea is that it's a interface effectively that has more access to more powerful things. Like it has access to all these things. So that file open box is a power box.
Yeah.
It can access all your files. But the thing that's asking the power box to give me a file actually can't access anything unless the power box gives it. So
Hmm.
by cooperating with the user, by cooperating with your file system, it's able to actually give that. So this is one example of a security flow that can protect users, right? So the important thing to understand with Spritely is that, like if you have two programs communicating over the network, um, they can hand each other access to specific things, but it's very specific. We don't do the programs running as you model. We do the explicitly granting consent model. So sometimes I describe Spritely's approach as being networks of consent, right? So like
Hmm.
any consent system, it's intentionally granted explicitly. It is revocable. It is
Hmm.
accountable, right? Like you can't have consent without those things, right?
Right.
So Spritely is building out, you can think of it as a network of consent, right? So it's a more user respecting consensual model that doesn't have gatekeepers at the heart of it, right? So that's kind of what we're building out. In order to build that right now, like so early on, I would like ActivityPub is actually much more neutral about some of these kind of security things. It doesn't really tell you how to do it right or not, right? And early on, I got really worried about the direction that the Fediverse was going when adopting ActivityPub, and they're like, "Well, it has these holes in the spec, which it does, right? About like how to handle security and stuff like that. Let's
Right. And
fill it
that,
in."
maybe the holes that then are, an open field for exploration, like at the time. Like we make the best decisions at the time with the information that we have. So,
Exactly. So
but
people solved it
then
with
you see people start doing things and then it's like, ooh, actually, maybe we should make it hard or impossible to do the things that we don't want to see.
or let's change the flows so that like that power box example in the browser, like people actually get the things they're expecting, they have the kind of security they want and expect. The program more naturally guides them towards a situation of security that reflects their intents, right? But that in order to get to that perspective, so part of the thing is like trying to convince most of the people adopting ActivityPub on how to do this. They were like, well, how do I do this? How do I use this kind of vision of things? And so I kind of hastily started writing out this document called OCAPPub that explained how to do it. And it was like how to use ActivityPub with object capability security. Um, and the main response I got was, how do I do this on Ruby on Rails? So I have no idea. And I'm like, oh, you're right. This is really hard to do on top of current tools. And consider
Mm,
these current tools are not built for peer-to-peer technology. They're built for client server stuff,
yes.
and they're specifically built for stuff to be deployed by a large corporation. Right? They're not built Docker, Ruby on Rails, etc. All that type of stuff. They're built for a large corporation to roll out with a DevOps team and so on. So they're not built for the kind of peer-to-peer, the economics are actually not there to think about the kind of peer-to-peer user-facing thing that we want. And here's an interesting thing that happens. It's not that these things aren't possible or that when they're available that people won't adopt them, right? It's that the work to go into building an alternative vision of things is really difficult to do up front.
Hmm.
So and it's difficult for people to understand what it'll be like until they get there. So it requires researchers to be able to put things together to be able to get towards that version. Now, so for example, um, uh, Meta has actually rolled out their own thing that's allegedly federating with the Fediverse. It's not very much so because they've blocked most things, but and most things are blocking them. And so but they have Threads, which allegedly is sort of ActivityPub compatible.
Hmm.
And Mark
I actually
Zuckerberg
didn't
made,
know that. Okay.
yeah, so Threads is ActivityPub
Threads
based,
is okay.
and so and it's partly a marketing thing. It's partly because we're getting regulatory pressure saying like, oh, you're a monopoly, et cetera. And they're like, oh, look, we're doing decentralization over here, right?
Mm,
And Mark Zuckerberg in an interview is like, oh, we've always been a fan of ActivityPub. Well, that's effing BS. I know it because when we were in the social web working group, we tried to get Facebook's and Twitter's attention, and at the time, they
hmm.
basically dismissed us as like, this is never going to happen. Um,
Right.
we
Well, because yeah, why would they invest anything in taking it seriously?
and in fact, an early version of the social web working group, the predecessor, had actually been blocked by Google because they were pushing Google Plus at the time. And then Google Plus failed, and then they stopped blocking it. And then by the time the social web working group stuff that happened, they said, "Oh, we've seen attempts to decentralize things happen several times. This just won't happen." So none of the big corporations that were involved. So we were a little bit lucky in a sense because ActivityPub actually was really pushed by enthusiasts in the standards group, people who really believed in it. But it was very difficult to keep to be able to justify our participation in the W3C, which is funded by corporate sponsors, right?
Yes.
To be able to say we had to convince W3C management, which did make an exception for us to keep running when we didn't have corporate participants anymore. Like IBM was early on involved in it, but they kind of backed out because their particular social thing they were no longer investing in it. It was like a business to business thing and stuff like that. So like we
Yeah, I
just
can't
didn't
even
have any.
remember an IBM social thing.
Yeah, but the simple thing to say is that it's easy to say. Of course, we always believed that this was going to happen. Of course, we're going to adopt this once it exists, right?
Sure.
Um, and I actually, in some ways, I can blame Facebook for doing that, about face on that. But I can't blame everyone else where I was trying to explain why ActivityPub was important and they kind of couldn't get it at that time, because it is actually really hard to do that. There's an interesting article by Chip Morningstar, one of the other people who worked on electric communities, called "You Can't Tell Anyone Anything," and it's a little bit, it's a little bit like, like this is my like I'm frustrated with,
It's a
but
rant. Yeah.
yeah, a little. It's not quite,
No?
but it kind of gives that
It
feeling
was
from the
guessing.
outset. And when you
Okay.
read it, actually, it's very thoughtful. Um, but the thought what Chip says in there is Chip was involved in. Are you familiar with Xanadu?
No.
Pre World Wide Web version of hypertext. It was like the original
Okay.
kind of vision for hypertext that, um, um, and it didn't end up succeeding, but it was like being worked on for a couple decades. And Chip Morningstar was one of the people working on Xanadu. And he says in this article, when I was at Xanadu, one of my jobs was to actually go around the country and explain to people what hypertext was going to be like. And they'd see it, they'd be amazed, but then they didn't really get it. They'd ask these questions like, but who's going to pay for all those links? And like,
Right.
like who's going to do, like how are you going to control? And he was like, it was the type of questions that people ask when they've never experienced it, right? And how are people going to understand how to navigate it? People would ask questions like that, right? And like without, and so now I'm going to tie back to the video game thing. So last night I sent you an
Mm,
example of a video game called Circoban. It's this
yeah.
little game.
It's a
It's
little
like a
owl. Puzzles.
you're a little owl.
Yeah,
Maybe you should
cute.
explain it since you played it.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me a little bit of Baba as you.
Exactly. Yeah,
In
yeah, yeah.
terms of it's a little puzzle, you're a cute little animal pushing some stuff around. And um and I guess, so I'll say, in terms of me playing with that, I saw that it did have real like it, immediately had rewind capability and very easy. Um, and so I know that that's one of the things about that environment that was hyped as the, time travel.
Yes.
So,
So exactly, that's right. So what's this? We like to participate in little game jams because it's a time where the engineers can put in like a week and a half of work, like and where we put out a demo that shows off this very brainy technology, right? But it's something
hmm
that somebody can interact with. They can play the game, they can see that it's real, right? And so this particular demo showed off two things combined. One of them is Spritely Goblins, the distributed programming environment I mentioned. Now, it's not showing it off in a networked way, it's not showing off the security features, but it is showing off the time travel part. And the other thing is Hoot. So there is a project we have called Hoot. It's got a little cute owl mascot. It's for compiling Scheme programs and running them in the browser in WebAssembly. And the reason we had to do this is that we've chosen to use this obscure programming language, beloved by computer scientists but not by much of the rest of the world, called Scheme. It's in the family of
hmm
Lisps,
That's
um, and this compiles it so that it can run in the browser. Now, and the reason for that is that you it's very hard to get people to run things on their desktop. It's hard, especially to get them to be able to get things into app stores and everything. But everybody has a browser, right?
hmm
So the browser is where you want to be. It's where everyone is, right? Everyone has a browser. But we had to get our technology over there, and there's a reason we're using Scheme. Solving these problems is really hard. Figuring out how to solve them is really challenging. And a lot of computer science research typically happens in Lisps and has happened in Lisps because, and you notice I have a Lisp and I lisp when I lisp. So, um, um, but a lot of computer science research happens in Lisp because it's a language that's very good for exploring ideas. But we have to get it to people. So we have Hoot. Now, um, what that game showed off was both things combined. A, you're playing the game in your browser,
in the
an
browser,
ordinary
right?
browser. Yeah. And so it's very easy to get up and running. And B, these types of puzzle games, you want the ability to rewind time. You want an undo because if you push a box into the corner, you might not be able to get it out, and so you
Yes.
want to be able to rewind it, right? Um,
hmm
now, in many games, this rewind thing is a very complicated thing to build, but it's not on top of our tech. In fact, no game logic was added to support the rewind. All we did was hook it up to the UI because Goblins actually comes with that built in. Now, the reason we have this in Goblins is because time travel is just transactionality. It's
Sure.
and we use that for if an error happens, like if somebody sends you a message over the network and something goes wrong, we don't want any corrupted state. It rolls back automatically, and then we inform the person sending the message that something went wrong so that they can behave appropriately in response to that. But we don't want to cause unintentional screw ups of the system. We don't want to send any messages to anybody else that for kind of a half-baked plan. We don't want this, that, or the other, right? We want things to roll back. So that's one way in which we end up simplifying things, and so it's a feature that Goblins has. And it's when you say, "Oh yeah, we have a system with unlimited transactionality," people are like, "Blah," right? Like, what does that mean, right? But if you say we have a system with unlimited transactionality, aka time travel, and then they play a game and then they press and it just moves back, they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I get that," right? We can roll things back when things go badly, right? So
hmm
so Spritely is working on a lot of really brainy projects. These brainy projects are sometimes difficult to explain and kind of get out there in front of people. It's becoming easier as more and more of the tech is out there and able to be put in people's hands. But while we're not at the point yet where we have end user applications that people are going to be using every day, we're able to build demos that actually show off interesting pieces bit by bit and show it's not vaporware, right? This stuff actually runs, right?
Right. And I think you captured something. I think the thing that we were talking about earlier, this idea of like when you're trying to imagine the future, that it's really hard to imagine things that haven't happened. We describe things in the shape of things that already exist. We describe a car as a horse that doesn't have to be fed or gets fed gasoline or gas. Anyway, but we conceptualize things in because that's just how it works. And then
Early,
there's
early,
kind of
early
this tipping
cars.
point.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to
Go
interrupt you,
ahead,
but
early cars
but
are
your point was just so good. I started jumping in because
horseless
the
carriages, right?
yeah, horseless carriages, and oftentimes they would actually put horse heads, like metal horse heads,
Because people are
in
like,
front
this
of.
is so weird.
Yeah, this is so weird. So people are going to be weirded out by this idea of it being this mechanical horse. So we have to make it more familiar. So you put a metal horse head on, and then people drive cars for a bit. They're like, we don't need this horse head here, right? Um,
Hmm.
so you're exactly right. Um, sorry again for just jumping in there.
No, it
I
was
love the
great
horse. I love the horse head
on cars.
yeah, yeah, on
Yeah, you have
cars.
to put it in a shape that people can understand so that then, yeah, and that's interesting because I've never worked in research, and so this idea that you're working on things and you kind of have to, I don't know, how do you keep the faith and the motivation that you're working on things that, you said it took 4 years for the activity pub standard to go through, that arduous process and this building things where, it might not go anywhere. It might, be, end up as but then who knows? Like it might not go anywhere for you or in your life. It might go into someone's bibliography for their, amazing paper in 15 years.
Things often don't succeed as the immediate thing, but they end up
Mm-hmm.
becoming something important for the long term. My work on ActivityPub and Jessica Talon, who also works at Spritely now, we both were working on a project called Media Goblin. I was kind of the lead engineer, and Jessica Talon was working on the Federation support.
Mm-hmm.
And we joined the social web working group and both became part of the standards effort for Media Goblin to have a standard to talk to each other, right? So that we could have this decentralized media publishing platform. By the time that, so part of I went through kind of an existential crisis towards the end of ActivityPub because I had to put Media Goblin on hold during the ActivityPub standardization process. And by the end of it, I was like, well, what do I do? This community's kind of languished. And
Yeah.
also, now we have PeerTube and we have Funkwhale and stuff like that, and they're doing the things I was trying to
What's
do.
Funk Wheel?
It's like a SoundCloud but decentralized.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah. Um, and we
Hmm.
have these things now, and they didn't exist when I was trying to get started, right? So like, um, in some ways I felt like embarrassed, like like I guess Media Goblin was a failure, but actually the reality is that Media Goblin was a huge success. Because if it
Mm.
wasn't for Media Goblin, we wouldn't have had ActivityPub, right? Like and by that I don't mean that Media Goblin invented ActivityPub, because actually the core design came out of Pump.io, Evan Prodromo's kind of successor to StatusNet, which was like the first version of the Fediverse actually existed in the late aughts. It was called StatusNet. There was like Identica was one of the big servers, and there were some others, um, and that failed in the sense that it was really backed by a big venture capitalist backed company that fell apart, and then and then Evan decided to continue things with Pump.io, but Pump.io was like this proof of concept for how Evan thought that the decentralized web should work. Pump.io never gained that much traction. It had some big enthusiasts, including myself, who actually thought that the core ideas were really good. But the API became the core API that turned into ActivityPub. And Spritely was one of the adopters of that API. Sorry, Media Goblin was, and then Media
Hmm.
Goblin moved in, didn't succeed, but ActivityPub did. So I think one of the things that, in order to, it can be gut wrenching when something doesn't succeed. So you
Yeah.
have to take a longer view. In some ways, that's what the Spritely Institute has kind of bought into from the beginning. It's very possible that some of our core pieces of work are not actually going to be successful in terms of Spritely's things itself being adopted. We hope they do, right? We hope Goblins is like the programming environment of the future. But it could be that the protocol we're developing, which is OCAPN, ends up being picked up by everything else and Goblins is not as successful. And is that a failure if that happens? No, it's success, right? It's success to be able to, because then you change the world in a different way, right? So the Spritely Institute is a research institution because we are trying to build the next generation of things. And so the way that we keep ourselves motivated is that we've done the research, we know what the future should be like, right? So like we have a strong understanding of what the pieces should be because we've prototyped things and we know how things can fit together and we've done our research. And in the process, we're building stuff that we really believe in, that works the way that we think it should work. And we're trying to make it more accessible to others. And we're having fun in the process, right? You know, every now and then we get a week to make a cute game that we can show off and that people can have fun with. And then we go back to the hard work and we stay focused for, a while longer. And then we put out another demo. And every
Mm,
time we do one of that, we incrementally get closer to the actual vision that Spritely is working towards, which is a
mm,
end user facing experience, right? It's not just these very brainy pieces of technology at the lower level steps, but you have to start there because it's too hard to build decentralized network technology and nigh impossible to build the vision that Spritely is doing using current tools and current protocols. You have to put down some new foundations to be able to build a better house.
mm. That's the thesis. Well, and I feel like that's a really nice end cap. So, if people want to find out more, what are some places you suggest they go, and if you have socials or things like that that you want to share?
We're on Spritely.Institute. Um, for the socials, you can find them from there. But we are on X Twitter, though I don't really use it personally anymore. And we are
Yeah.
on the Fediverse, but we're about to move to different servers. So I actually just recommend go to Spritely.Institute. And what I really recommend is click the news page and
Hmm.
lose yourself for several days going down a rabbit hole of all the incredible things we've put out because we really have put out a lot of things. I find, like one of the most common comments we get about Spritely is, I discovered Spritely and, like I went and I ended up going down so many rabbit holes because there were so many interesting things I found by starting to explore your stuff. So,
That, I mean, that pretty much describes when you sent me the links, and I was like, there's even like, I really enjoyed our conversation. There's so many other things too that I, you know, doing ask you about, like Guile, like, oh man, that I was
mhm.
like asking about that.
There's so many
But
exciting things out there. Take your time exploring them. That's what I think is good.
awesome. Well, and then I'm working on remembering to say the socials for this podcast is that Ignore All Previous Instructions is on Instagram at techcult.podcast, on YouTube at techcultpodcast. And thank you for listening to Ignore All Previous Instructions. Until next time.
Take care.